So my original intent was to title this video Photographic Testimony, because that's really what the intent is. That's what it is. I'm going to try to lay out who I am and what I've done in the photography world, my experience and stuff. But as I was thinking about it, I thought, a lot of photography channels should kind of lay out who they are, because on YouTube, you never know, the experience of the person talking, whether they really know what they're talking about or not. And then I got to thinking, who am I to be calling anybody else out to do things like this? Because I've got 17 subscribers and 3 of them are accounts that my mom has. So then I got to thinking, I need more subscribers. I better come up with a title that's a little more catchy, which then I got to thinking I'll probably be accused of having a title that's just clickbait. Well, I've only got 17 subscribers, so yeah, maybe it is clickbait. I just kind of want to go through chronologically my experience and my life in photography and kind of lay out who I am and what I've done and education and stuff. And so let's do that. Let's go back to the beginning. Well, maybe that's a little too far back. Okay, so I was born and raised in Denver, Colorado, and my love for photography probably started when I was in my early teen years. My family did a lot of family vacations, and my dad had one of those old SLRs that were huge tanks, and we used to shoot a lot of slide film on these family vacations. And I just started using his camera and taking some pictures and really enjoyed it. And I remember taking my first photography class in junior high school at Lakewood Junior High School in Lakewood, Colorado. And we, kind of haphazardly learned how to shoot film and develop it, and then take that film and make prints in the darkroom. And I can remember the very first time I put the paper in the developer tray and watched my image come up. And if you've never shot film or done darkroom work like that, it's quite a kind of a magical moment to watch your image come up like that. And I just fell in love with it from there, and took every class I could take in high school. I was on the yearbook staff as a photographer a couple years in high school, and we continued to take those family vacations. And I eventually bought my first camera, which was a Canon AE1. I bought that. I thought I was large and in charge, had my own camera, and I'd save all my money to buy film, and took all the pictures I could take. So in all those years in high school, I knew what I wanted to do for a living was be a photographer. I wasn't quite sure how I was going to make that happen, but I knew that's what I wanted to do. And I think at the time, I really thought all professional photographers, at least the elite professional photographers in the world, were National Geographic photographers. And so that was kind of my vision and my dream. I wanted to do travel photography and sports, Sports Illustrated type assignments. And, I really thought everybody uses a 35mm camera, and I wasn't sure how to go about doing that. So I worked full time and saved some money and continued to take pictures on vacations and traveling and such. And eventually, during those 2 years, I started looking into photography schools, and finally made a decision that I was going to go to school. And that's how I was going to go about doing it. So I looked into different schools across the country and landed on the Ohio Institute of Photography in Dayton, Ohio. Well, I packed up my little car and I drove halfway across the country and went to Dayton, Ohio. And although I had some family in Ohio, I didn't know anybody in Dayton. And so it was quite a challenge. But I started a 2-year program there, and it was awesome. I can't say enough about that school. But I quickly, the very first class was a black and white class, and you learn film and darkroom techniques and developing film, but it was on a much higher level than anything I had experienced at that point, because we were technically learning, some really solid things about photography and how to do it right. And even in that very first class, we were introduced to large format photography, which was, I just fell in love with large format cameras, and introduced to commercial photography, which is what I ended up doing. I ended up getting my degree in commercial photography. But that school, we learned color, we learned how to process color film and print color prints, and lighting, extensive lighting classes. And yeah, I mean, it was 2 years, but it was well worth the 2 years. I fell in love with Dayton. I kind of call it my adopted hometown. And yeah, I couldn't have been more happy with the 2 years I spent there. I went from thinking everybody was a National Geographic photographer that was a professional, to understanding, advertising and commercial and corporate, and, the portrait possibilities. And I left that school with a great deal of knowledge and an associate's degree in commercial photography. Now, the school did help students find jobs. And I had one job interview when I left school, and that was in Nashville, Tennessee, another town that I didn't know anybody. But I did go down to that interview. It was for a freelance assistant. Oh, it wasn't a freelance assistant. It was for a commercial photographer was looking for a full-time assistant. So I went down there and applied for that job. I met the guy. He had a neat little studio. It was exciting. And at the end of the interview, yeah, I don't know if I tanked it or he just wasn't quite sure, but he said, I'll hire you as a freelancer. And if things work out, we'll make it a full-time position. And it makes sense to me now that he said that. But at the time, I'm thinking I'm going to drive, I'm going to move to a town that I don't know anybody in the hopes that this job will pan out. And I thought, I can just go back to Denver and be a freelance assistant. And so that's what I did. I packed that car back up that I had driven out in, packed it up again, and I drove back to Denver. So I went back home, I went back to Denver, and in my mind, I thought, I'm going to start being a freelance assistant. And I'm sure there's still freelance assistants in the world today, but back then it was a big thing. And what being a freelance assistant meant was a lot of commercial photographers in town would not have full-time assistants, but whenever they had a job or a need to hire an assistant, they would hire somebody just for a day or 2 days or even a half a day. And I was going to be one of those guys. And the trick to it was to get enough photographers that would call you on a regular basis that you would work, every day if you could. I was never great at it. I'd book a day or two here and then a day or two there. It was fantastic in terms of experience and learning from different photographers. I learned a lot what to do. I learned a lot what not to do. Some of them, as the assistant, you carried all the gear. And so I learned a lot of ways not to pack gear because it was bulky and heavy. And so in that regard, it was great. I was never very good at booking myself solid. I'd like I said, I'd work a day here or a day there. And so, booking 5 days a week, 4 days a month was a challenge for me. But eventually I ran into a couple of photographers that seemed to like me, and they would call me back on a regular basis. One guy in particular actually did some shooting for Cabela's, the sporting goods store. And at the time, they used to shoot all their catalogs in Sidney, Nebraska. A bunch of freelance guys from Denver would go up there, and they needed an assistant. And the guy that I knew said, why don't you call Todd? And they did, and said, hey, the job's yours if you can get up here. So again, I packed up my car, drove to Sidney, Nebraska, and helped them shoot a catalog. And I think I was up there for about 4 weeks. And I did 3 or 4 catalogs over the next year and a half with them, which was an amazing experience. It was steady work, which was fantastic. And I got better at being an assistant. I learned more about photography. And somewhere along the lines in there too, I met a guy named Dennis Lane. And to this day, Dennis Lane is probably the best photographer I ever worked for. I did a little bit of freelancing with him, and then he ended up hiring me full-time. But Dennis did anything from products to people. He had a client that we did baby products for, so we had infants in and out of the studio during those days. But his one main client at the time was a department store, and we did all their newspaper ads. We did pots and pans and socks and jewelry and all that kind of thing. And I learned a ton from Dennis. He's still in business today. Like I said, he was probably one of the best. He could light anything. He could approach any situation and do it and do it well. So I between Cabela's and Dennis, I learned a lot about photography. And one of the cool stories in my days working with Dennis, he used to pay me every week. So every Friday he'd write me a paycheck. And I might have been making $250 a week. It wasn't a ton. And I worked Monday through Friday for him. It was fantastic. Single guy, just had my weekends. And one of the weeks, I also did all the black and white darkroom stuff for him. And in his darkroom on a bottom shelf, he had a view camera. And one week I got the idea that I'd go to him and say, instead of paying me a paycheck this week, can I have that camera? Because I knew he didn't use it. He had other cameras that we used on a regular basis, and that one was just under there collecting dust. And he immediately said, yeah, that'd be fine. So I got my first view camera, trading a week of work for that. And so I started trying to accumulate gear that I thought I would need to start being a shooter. So Dennis had this department store client, and at some point, I think I had been working for Dennis for about a year, and the department store decided that they were going to take all their freelance work and take it in-house and start their own in-house studio, which was kind of a trend back in those days. A couple of different businesses were doing that, and I knew that as soon as Dennis lost that client, he probably wouldn't have a need for me. So I kind of became proactive and went to the department store and applied for one of the positions in the in-house studio, which they had two positions, and they were excited about that. And I got hired as, let's say, the second shooter slash darkroom guy. And they had a fabulous black and white darkroom. We processed all our own film, did all our own printing, and me and another guy did all the product photography for them. And I was there probably 2.5 years. Again, Monday through Friday job, neat little studio, and it was great. Shot all the, like I said, pots and pans and socks and jewelry and perfume and anything a department store runs in a newspaper ad, that's what we were doing. In those days when I was working for the department store, I met my wife, we got married, and I thought everything was, fabulous and perfect, had the perfect little job, had a wonderful wife, and, as life kind of throws curveballs and things change, the department store got bought out by another department store, which happened to be in Kansas City, and all their advertising went to their store, which meant our advertising department was getting laid off. I think one person kept their job, and it wasn't me. So after 2.5 years or so at that job, I got laid off. And I wasn't concerned about it. I guess I figured I'd just go back to freelancing. But in the process of, I think there was about a month where, the studio was closing and you didn't get any severance unless you stayed till the end. So I stayed till the end. And one of the girls in the PR department saw me one day and said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "Well, I guess I'm going to start freelancing." And the PR department did a bridal show. I didn't realize this, but the department store put on a bridal show twice a year, I think. And she said, "Well, I can get you a free booth at the bridal show if you want it." And I had shot a wedding or two. I think if you're a photographer, somebody's inevitably going to ask you if you can do their wedding. And I had done a couple. So I said to her, sure. I wasn't exactly sure. So my wife and I what little wedding work I had done, we threw together some prints and some albums and got ready for this bridal show. And I think I got laid off on the 1st of July maybe that year, and by July 20th or so was the bridal show. So we didn't have much time, but we put it all together, and we had our first bridal show. And I look back on it even to this day and think, I'm not sure why, but people hired us, and we started shooting weddings, which surprisingly to me, I enjoyed it. And the big, you know, in the mid 90s came the photojournalistic craze of wedding photography, which made it even more fun to photograph weddings. And Amy and I started shooting a lot of weddings. I continue to shoot commercial work and do some freelance assisting as well. And you know, our little business just took off. We were doing 50 weddings a year at one point, and it led to a lot of other freelance work. Now, I do have to say, and I meant to say this at the beginning when I started talking about going back to Denver and all the freelance work that I was doing, a lot of the photos that I'm showing are Polaroids. You got the white edges and the black around the square images. If you're not familiar with the film process, back in the film days, you know, we would shoot a Polaroid image of a photo shoot to check the lighting, to check the exposure, to make sure everything was the way we wanted. And once we got the right Polaroid, we would then go to film. So over the years, I've kept a lot of outtake Polaroids. In fact, I have a whole book of them from, you know, and as a freelance assistant, I used to be the stand-in guy. You know, Todd, go stand in there and let me take a Polaroid real quick before the models came out. So I have them. I have Polaroids from that. I have Polaroids from when I was doing work. A lot of Polaroids of Amy standing in. But that's what you're seeing. And the ones that have tape around them are kind of showing how we were going to end up cropping it. So I think Amy and I shot weddings and did freelance work for 7 years, I believe. And without getting into the whole story of why and leadings and whatever, we felt inclined to move to Ohio. And that was a long process. It was a couple of years of, should we really do that? Should that's crazy, isn't it? To pack up our stuff and just move to Ohio? We got a business going here. And we really felt led to do that. We had my oldest son had been born. He was a year. And we wanted to move to a small town in Ohio, raise our family, and just move our business over there. So we did. 2001, we packed everything up in a couple of moving vans and had some help from family, and we set off across the country and moved back to Ohio. So now it's Amy, myself, and our oldest son, Timothy. He's a year and a half. We head back to Ohio, and the plan was to start our business there, but I knew, you know, it might take a little while to get it started. So I called the school that I used to go to, and Greg Wurtzler was the guy that was my very first instructor. He still was there, and I asked Greg, is there any way I could teach part-time? And he was excited and said, yeah, we got a place for a part-time instructor. So I went back and taught, and I really thought, you know, I'm going to teach part-time. It's not going to last very long while we get the business up and running, because I think we can get this wedding business in Ohio going pretty quickly. Well, within 6 months of being there, I was asking them for a full-time position. And fortunately, they had one. One of the full-time instructors was leaving. I slid right in and took his place, and I taught for 7 years at the school that I had graduated from many years before that. And I taught everything from the beginning classes to the advanced portrait classes, as well as some commercial classes. I taught business practices, ended up teaching some Photoshop classes. And the truth was, had I known when I graduated college that I was going to shoot weddings and end up going back and being an instructor at the school I started at, I probably at that time would have thought my career failed. because I didn't want to do either one of those things. But I truly ended up loving both of those things. I loved teaching. I knew I wasn't really called or destined to be a teacher forever, but I did enjoy it. And the truth of the matter, as far as when I taught, when I started that school, it was 100% film, except for maybe, I think the beginning classes had one digital assignment, and some of the commercial classes were starting to do a little bit of digital. But by the time I left, the only film classes that were available 7 years later were some of the artistic elective classes. So I was there during the entire digital switchover, starting from digital capture to the entire process. I was there when Lightroom was introduced by Adobe. So I was in the perfect spot to learn digital when that whole thing switched. And the other incredibly fortunate thing that I had while I was there is all the instructors shared offices. There weren't enough offices for the instructors to have their own office by and large, and I ended up getting put in an office with, I'll call him the Photoshop instructor. He was one of several, but his main thing was Photoshop, and he also had been a student at that school before, but his name was Mark Sela, still a friend to this day. In fact, I would call him a good friend to this day. Out of the blue, he will text me and say, hey, can you look at some work I'm doing? I do the same thing to him. We can keep in close contact, but not only was I at the school when it was switching from film to digital, I was in the office with the guy who knew Photoshop backwards and forwards. And my Photoshop skills to this day, I attribute to everything I learned from Mark, and probably, things I can still run by him today and learn from him to this day. So being in that environment and sharing an office with Mark, again, invaluable as far as my skill set and learning, and it was great. And I have half my friends on Facebook are former students. Yeah, it was a great 7 years. So about 7 years into teaching, there was something that was, again, kind of like the leading of going from Denver to Ohio. Amy and I knew our time was running short there, and I don't know how to explain that, but kind of got itchy feet, I guess, and we started to look for jobs, shooting, and the other thing too, I should mention, when I was teaching, I was freelancing the entire time. So I had lots of jobs outside of just teaching. Again, weddings. We were shooting a lot of weddings in Ohio. I did freelance work. Anything I could find. In fact, Mark used to make fun of me that I would do anything for money, photographically, and that's a running joke to this day. But I did a lot of work, and we got to a place where we thought, okay, the teaching thing is just about done. There was a sense that, the economy in Ohio wasn't great. The school numbers as far as students were kind of starting to go down. And so we started looking for work. And my parents had moved, while we were in Ohio, my parents had moved to Asheville, North Carolina. So we had come down there several times to visit them and loved the area. So one of the places we were looking was around there. And I ended up finding a job, actually Amy found it for me, in Spartanburg, South Carolina. And probably about a year or so into talking to them and such, we ended up coming down and interviewing for that job. So I came to Spartanburg, South Carolina and interviewed for what was essentially a catalog commercial photographer job. For a company called Smile Makers, and Smile Makers sells toys and stickers and giveaway stuff to doctors and dentists. So like when your kid goes to the dentist and there's a big treasure chest bin full of toys for them to choose something after their appointment, that's what Smile Makers does. And they were looking for a photographer to do all of their product work, as well as the I wouldn't really call it fashion work as much as I would call it, you know, the model stuff. So I got that job in 2008, I believe, and we came down in the fall of 2008, packed up our family, which now had a second son, and we drove from Ohio down to Spartanburg, South Carolina, and I started that job, and I've been there ever since. And ironically, I think when I left OIP the first time as a student, the perfect job was a little studio work where I could sit in there by myself and do product work, and that's where I'm at today, which is interesting. All these years later, I kind of found the perfect job. And today I continue to freelance. I don't do very many weddings anymore, but we do a little bit of wedding work. Bridal portraits is probably one of my favorite things. We do some of those. We do some events, various freelance work to this day. Shot for Cabela's again. We did a grand opening of a Cabela's in Greenville, South Carolina. But yeah, that's where we're at today. Full-time at Smile Makers and continue to do freelance work. Yeah, that's where we're at. You know, along with freelance work that I come up with, I do a lot of stock photography today, which I want to do some videos about stock photography. Yeah, just keep trucking. Thanks for watching, guys. Okay, last thing before I go, guys. There's a link in the description for Mark Sela. He's the guy that I taught with and I shared an office when I was teaching in Ohio. Mark is the king at Photoshop. He is an amazing illustrator, just an amazing artist all around. Check out his work, send him some love. He's got a YouTube channel. He probably doesn't want to admit it yet, but it's out there. Yeah, good friend of mine to this very day, and big shout out to him. So check it out. Bye.